This is Pet Life Radio. Let's talk pets.
Welcome to Aquariumania. I'm your host, Dr. Roy Anong, speaking to you from the University of Florida IFAS Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory. Thanks for joining us. The catfishes, members of the order Siluriformes, include over 3,000 species that vary widely in size, appearance, biology, and ecology. So what do catfish eat? Fishkeepers are often confused and assume that a one-size-fits-all approach works. My guest today, Rebecca Bentley, has a lot to say on that subject. Rebecca is an ichthyologist with a broad understanding of catfishes, but specializing in the feeding morphology of the loricariid or pleco family of fishes. Join us as we learn more about the science of catfish nutrition from an expert on the subject. We'll be right back after these messages.
How many of you have pets? My hand's raised. Now think about how lucky you are to have such a sweet little pet in your life, and that pet is lucky to have you too. But unfortunately, there are countless pets out there that don't have a home to call their own. However, Bob's from Skechers is trying to change that. So we developed Bob's for dogs and cats to help pets in need. With every purchase of adorable Bob's footwear or fun, stylish apparel, or even the cutest Bob's pet accessories, Skechers makes a donation to Petco Love to help save shelter pets. And with your help, we've already saved the lives of over 1 million pets and raised over $7 million. So while you're getting style and comfort with features like Skechers' famous memory foam cushioning, you're also helping to save an adorable pet in need and helping another lucky owner be connected with a future best friend and companion, because happiness is having a loving pet by your side. Find Bob's at a Skechers store, Skechers.com, select Petco locations, or wherever stylish footwear is sold.
Let's Talk Pets on PetLifeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Aquariumania on Pet Life Radio. My guest today is Rebecca Bentley, a scientist and catfish expert with a particular interest in catfish morphology as it relates to feeding and diet. Hey, Rebecca, thanks for joining us.
Hi, it's good to be here. Thank you.
So, as I usually do, and you probably know, I like to kind of ask some personal questions first related to you and the hobby. How old were you when you had your first aquarium, and do you remember what was in it?
So, I had my first aquarium when I was 10 years old, and there's this brand called Sarah, and they used to do leaflets. I think it's a German brand. They aren't so common anymore, but they had this like different types of setups. And I saw I really wanted what's known as the dwarf cockatoo cichlid or Apistogramma cacatoides. So a pair of those was my first fish that I kept.
Very nice. How did they do? Did they survive?
Yes, they did survive for quite a while. My dad had kept fish beforehand, but I don't really count that as me keeping fish. So I had background, I guess. But they never bred. They were kept in hard water. And I always wanted to try and breed them, but I wasn't quite confident or sure about how to do it, because back then, well, I was only 10, so I didn't have access to all the resources. It was mostly books, which are a little bit vague. Well, the ones I had access to. That's
true. Did you have any other tanks after that?
So I went through different phases. I went through Siamese fighting fishes. So I had loads of different betters, and then fancy goldfish. So obviously different size setups between them. For the betters, I had much smaller setups. For the fancy goldfish, I then also end up keeping many outside. And then eventually I just found catfishes. So I've got 2 tanks at the moment. So I've always had aquariums, just different size ones and different setups.
So what would you say were maybe the major influences and things that got you interested in aquarium and aquatic biology? So I think mainly it's just I'm really interested in the fishes themselves. So their body shape, their morphology, their whole biology, how they interact with each other. And they're just so diverse. It's not like, I think when I look at other groups of animals, they don't have that diversity of body shapes, even though fishes is not strictly one group of animals. It's a bit more complex than that. They are just so different. They're so alien, and there's so little we understand about them.
The influences, though, is a little bit, it's always just been mostly the fish. I do really like looking at different resources. So I like looking at older books, and mostly journals I find are my biggest influence now, such as the Journal of Fish Biology. That's when I'm constantly looking through for more influence and something that sort of sparks my interest a bit more than looking at traditional websites and books now.
And how did you, I guess, or when and how did you become involved in the aquarium hobby? Obviously, you're kind of, very into the hobby, but also a scientist. So how did sort of that kind of happen?
So I've had the aquarium since I was 10 and always been interested in that side of it. And then one day I saw a job advertisement at an aquarium store that was just starting up. And I think I was 18 at the time, and I applied for it. I got the job. And that was when I started actually in the industry itself. And I did 6 years in the industry in different stores. So that independent store, it closed down after 2 years, and it did open back up. And then that also did pond maintenance. So I had more experience of ponds and also marines. They had no issues with beginners or whatever doing marine. So I also ended up working with marines and freshwater, and decided that my interest is in freshwater. And then I worked for sort of semi-independent and then the largest aquarium chain store in the UK. And I worked there for 2 years, and I just wanted to focus on the science in general. And I think science is my passion. So I've worked in a few other jobs other than that. And I did teach animal management for all of 3 months, I guess.
Oh, that's good. So yeah, it sounds like you have a lot of experience in the industry, which is really,
yes.
really helpful. Definitely. So what made you make the leap and decide to get your PhD, that quite a major leap from working in the industry?
So I don't know where it started, but I always said I wanted to be an ichthyologist, and it's defining what it is like. To me, even if you have a degree, it doesn't make you a biologist. So I was like, what level is it that I am going to be an ichthyologist? And I want to do it for a career. So I really do need to do a PhD. And it's a long load of different applications and stuff like that. On the side of my jobs in the industry, I did my master's and my undergraduate degree. So it was sort of on the side anyway. And I'm really interested in the science more than the actual practical side, I guess. Although I like to apply the science to the practical side as well.
That's right. Your master's as well. So and I think it's actually, personally, I think it's really important that there are a lot of folks like you who understand the industry and are, like the assignment of it, but are bringing the science to it as well. So that's great. I'm excited. And that's why you're here. So let's talk a little bit about catfishes. And, I guess you could tell us, first of all, why catfish versus the many, many, many other groups of fish.
So catfish the start for me looking at catfishes is just, I was deciding between reproductive biology, which to me, I can't imagine it'd be a bit more, not as diverse or as interesting to actually study. So then it was taxonomy and evolution. And what's one of the widest diversities that you can actually see, or radiations is the probably more better scientific term. And catfishes is one of the largest. I think it's around like 5,000 species. It doesn't beat siphonoids, Siluriformes, which is carp, minnow, that lot. And cichlids, obviously, they're one of the biggest radiations when it comes to that niche group in the Rift Valley. But catfishes are just so unusual, and most people see that sort of like the North American catfishes, they see them ichthyologist, and that's what they see as a catfish. But there's so much more diversity. There's loricariid, which they have that dermal plating, which catfishes don't have proper scales, so it's something entirely different. Then you've got ones which are more loach-like, trichomycids. There's quite a lot you don't even see in the hobby. There's ones that look like hill stream loaches in Asia, and I think there's some in Africa. There's just so many, and they're not really studied as well as they could be, especially ones in certain regions, and their evolution. A lot of focuses in my group, the loricariids, the plecos, is in their sort of how their taxonomy, how to build that family tree, the phylogeny, whereas there's not as much on their morphology and there's so much being missed on that. And in other groups, I know the African Cynodontis and Chiloglanis, they're often neglected when it comes to studies. And even I think in the aquarium hobby, people with Cynodontis, people think of them as all hard water. They all grow large, they're all sort of, but there's so many from the Congo region, there's different sizes, different shapes. Many are social, there's loads of soft water ones. So there's so much diversity just in catfishes themselves. And you've got the pelagic, the ones that swim at like almost nothing like tuna, but that sort of level of water where they're just swimming in massive shoals, Pangasidae, so Pangasius or Bassa, I think you might buy it as for food. Yeah,
So as you mentioned, in the catfish is the order the Siluriformes. There's so many major groups. You actually described, and I wasn't sure if this was for your master's. You described a new species of Corydoras catfish.
So this is Corydoras bethanae. And this was actually described as part of, it wasn't anything to do with my master's. It was because in the UK, and I think in the US, there's quite a good sort of network of different catfish keepers, catfish owners and enthusiasts, and also integrating with the scientists. So there's many scientists that also keep fishes and interact, talk on Facebook, on Planet Catfish, probably also on Twitter. But that's where quite a lot of us ended up collaborating, and I collaborated with two other people. So Luis Tenkat is a scientist in Brazil, specialising mostly in those sort of catfishes. And Steve Grant is an amateur scientist. He doesn't get paid for any of it, I don't think. And he's described quite a few different species. And then he's got a particular interest in Corydoras. Hence, he chose the name of Corydoras bethanae, which is CW006 on the number system, and also one of the skunk corys, but probably not a traditional cory in most senses, as they're quite nasty, I guess. You keep them in harems because the males really are not particularly keen on each other.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that group and maybe some of the differentiation that you did? I did kind of briefly go through your paper, but maybe explain a little bit about what you mean when you're talking about these differences.
So most of it was done looking at also splitting up the lineages. So Corydoras right now is one genus, but there's work to split it up into several genera. So looking at the head shape, I think, is a particular obvious one, where the different lineages have quite a different head shape, and that's how you can differentiate some of the different of those skunk corys. You've got Corydoras grantii, which is quite short-headed, and then you've got Corydoras narcissus, which is maybe a bit more elongate. Corydoras narcissus is much larger. And then also Corydoras bethanae, which I think is a bit more wedge-shaped. It's lineage 8, I think, which is different from Narcissus, which is 1, which is the true Corydoras. So that includes Corydoras fulleri as well, which is named after Ian Fuller. Anyone that knows Corydoras, he's put a particular name in that side of the hobby. But it's mostly looking at also the markings. The markings are a little bit different in how that skunk pattern is shown.
I also learned a new word when I was reading it. The if I say it correctly, aposematism. Can you explain what that is? And you mentioned a few kind of potential things that were maybe reasons for some of these markings.
So it's not particularly been well studied, but a lot of it is to do with the markings anyway. I don't really study coloration particularly well, but it's mostly whether it relates to predation and their habitat. Steve Grant's done quite a few talks on the topic, but looking at how the water actually interacts with their patterning and also polarization. So that sort of thing. But I don't really I look more into the skeletal details than coloration, because most of my specimens, their coloration is not great because of how they're preserved. Formalin destroys it, but ethanol over time will totally bleach the fish.
Yeah, and that was actually a good point because I think when I was reading it, you mentioned sort of how they look from, obviously through the water column and everything. Because obviously I'm usually looking at cories through the side of a tank and not really
Yes.
from the top. So yeah, definitely. Well, I think we're gonna take a little bit of a break before we get into the meat of the discussion, which is catfish morphology and nutrition. So let's take a short break and we'll continue our discussion with my guest, Rebecca Bentley, ichthyologist and catfish nutrition expert, after these messages from our sponsors.
Take a bite out of your competition. Advertise your business with an ad in Pet Life Radio podcasts and radio shows. There is no other pet-related media that is as large and reaches more pet parents and pet lovers than Pet Life Radio. With over 7 million monthly listeners, Pet Life Radio podcasts are available on all major podcast platforms, and our live radio stream goes out to over 250 million subscribers on iHeartRadio, Odyssey, TuneIn, Stitcher, and other streaming apps. For more information on how you can advertise on the #1 pet podcast and radio network, visit PetLifeRadio.com/advertise today.
Let's talk pets
Let's talk pets
on Pet Life Radio.
Pet Life Radio.
PetLifeRadio.com.
We're back and continuing our conversation with my guest, Rebecca Bentley, ichthyologist and catfish nutrition scientist. So we talked a little bit about catfishes in general and some of the work you've done. Let's kind of jump in now and discuss nutrition and catfish. I know there's definitely a lot of confusion and there's catfish diets out there in the hobby. And I think a lot of folks are maybe not quite clear, all the different types of catfishes out there. Can you start maybe by talking a little bit about trophic levels, because some people may not know that term and what that means, and then discuss maybe different levels and associated diets?
So sort of when it comes to trophic diets, particularly in catfishes, trophic diets being what they feed on and sort of how they interact with that whole food web. With catfishes, there's one at sort of every level. You've got some of the large ambush predators, particularly when it comes to the gulper cat, which is quite a famous one that people enjoy keeping. There's also other sorts of predatory catfish. Most of them tend to be more ambushing in some manner. I don't really see too many that hunt, although you have got the parasitic catfishes, trichomycids. There's plenty of them. They might be specialising in fins or scales. And then there's the famous blood-sucking ones, Vandellia cirrhosa, which is the famous one. And then really, other than the carnivores, obviously, a lot of them are that sort of level of feeding maybe on mostly probably invertebrates at larger levels or sizes, maybe fish. But it really depends on the actual group. There's plenty that are actually feeding on diets that we kind of see as omnivory or herbivory. But then when we look at the aquatic sense or the aquatic context, what is actually herbivorous and carnivorous or omnivorous actually blurs a lot, because unlike in sort of the terrestrial world, when you're looking at how mammals feed, if they're feeding on a herbivorous diet, it's a little bit easier to sort of get that sort of really clear-cut line of that is plant matter. Whereas with fish, particularly a lot of them, they're going to be feeding not just on algae, which are very different, I think, compositionally wise to plants, even though some algae place very close to plants, some are totally different in that group. But they're also going to be feeding likely on different invertebrates. For example, rhizoa, which is these little fan-feeding organisms, sponges, which I think recently have been debated whether they are actually, how basic they are in animals, or whether they are animals at all. But they're just these filter feeding, sponges, as the name suggests. And then maybe other invertebrates that might be sort of arthropods and stuff like that. But really what they're feeding on is going to be, it's going to vary a lot in this composition. And it does depend on like their jaw shape, their teeth, And it's very difficult to actually match that in captivity. And we might not even know, because a lot of studies that at the moment will use the term detritivore and list detritus. But detritus could be anything. It could be maybe made up of more bacteria. It could be made up of more algae. And it's really difficult to actually draw that comparison to the terrestrial sense, especially when we don't have the papers. But this is where like loricariid and even synodontists come in. There's many synodontists that feed on that rasping motion on a surface. And I say it's kind of, a lot of them is like when you're looking at grass and you're seeing sheep, cows, horses, they're all feeding on different parts of that grass, or maybe different like aspects, or different actual grasses. And there's so much more precision to this that really does need studying, but also needs understanding in the hobby, especially for longer lifespans and health. Some of these fishes don't breed in captivity or have never been bred in captivity. Some have very low success. Take the gold nugget, Bariancistrus antellus, or any Bariancistrus. These are the big, well, you buy them very small, and they're probably very specialised in their diet in the wild. And they tend not to have a good growth rate. There's been, I think, 4 cases of them breeding, given how many get imported and wild caught. And they've also been very small specimens compared to those in the wild, which are reaching 30, 35 centimetres standard length. Well, total length, standard length is a bit more debatable. So that's excluding the tail. But it's so much more complex than a lot of, I think, how we see fishes, even in other fishes, cichlids, for example. There's so much more diversity to their diets, and it's very difficult to say herbivore, carnivore, detritivore, omnivore. Almost impossible, because it's not quite the same.
You mentioned a couple plecos or loricariids. Can you maybe talk a little bit about one or two that are a little more common in the hobby, for as in like examples of maybe differences in diet, even though they're all loricariids?
So this it's been studied, but I think there's a lot more debate that needs asking on it. So there are ones that are more carnivorous. There's not as many, I think, as many people think, or there isn't the literature available to actually say they are carnivores. So, for example, Scopiancistrus aureatus, which is the Goldie pleco or sunshine pleco, and also the cactus plecos, which are Pseudacanthicus. They are carnivores in different sort of niches. So these mostly feed on invertebrates. They don't feed on fish. It's not really that likely that they're going to be able to catch a fish, let alone actually. It's a little bit more difficult than, I guess, for other fishes. So they're mostly feeding on invertebrates. So insect larvae is going to be probably the most common, but also those sponges, those bryozoa. If you look at the mouth shapes, they're quite different. So Pseudacanthicus mostly feeding on sort of invertebrates, I guess, in general, where Pseudacanthicus has a mouth shape that's very narrow. So it's kind of just to get into like mollusks, so probably snails or bivalve. So I guess mussels, I'm not really sure exactly. It just, the literature is very vague on this aspect, but sort of using their teeth to wedge these things out. Then there's ones which are a bit more, I guess, there's no real sort of midline where they're feeding a lot on that and then feeding also a lot on plants, because their mouth shapes are so different. But there are ones that will feed on different aspects of more algivore, or so feeding mostly on algae and related organisms, I say, for it. So you've got ones that feed on the microbes, the fungi, the bacteria, particularly within wood. So that's like Panax, which is the royal pleco, and also the clown pleco, Panaculus. And they're feeding at different levels within that wood on the bacteria, not on the wood. There's been plenty of analysis to prove they cannot digest wood. So they're just looking for those things within the wood. Then there's loads of different aspects of surface feeding on the different organisms, on whether like in a crevice or on a flat surface. And I think that's where the largest diversity is. And with the teeth, then they might be feeding at different levels on that. And they're going to be feeding mostly on different bacteria, algae, protozoa, and the levels will depend on the actual on their teeth, on their jaws and stuff like that. So it is quite varied, and there's a lot that hasn't been studied on it.
Well, I appreciate that. And definitely, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I know there's a lot of people that think, plecos eat wood. And and obviously, as you mentioned, that's not necessarily correct. So definitely important. So obviously, you're interested in morphology. So you mentioned a few things with kind of the teeth. Are there any other sort of morphologic or GI type features that you think might be important for our listeners to understand with regard to diet?
So there's the actual sort of fleshy side of that suction cup that seems to be hinting at different diets. You've got ones that are very mobile in those organisms, those loricariids, those plecos that are really having to get into a crevice, trying to extract something. And then there's ones which are a lot more flat, probably going along the surface to feed. And there's also sort of different levels between that. The jaws are a big one. You can't really see the jaws given they are bones. You can kind of get an idea of them. The main difference is that the shorter jaws that have less teeth tend to be feeding more on invertebrates. The wider jaws with many teeth tend to be feeding more on algae and bacteria. And there's a whole spectrum within this, especially when you're looking at the different shapes of them. But that's the main sort of one we know so far.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a good kind of lesson. Obviously, we always encourage hobbyists to try to learn about their fish before they buy them, and look at things like even morphology and shape of the mouth and that sort of thing to help give them kind of clues. Even though there are some diets that are considered sort of general. Speaking of which, there are a lot of general tropical fish food diets out there, and also, as we've discussed, kind of some diets that are considered catfish diets. So can you talk a little bit about things that hobbyists should look at in terms of the formulations, a little bit of education on that, and then also what your thoughts are as well on commercial catfish diets? You might have to break that up a little bit.
Okay, so when it comes to diet, I always look first at ingredients. So a lot of people are like, they just look at the percentage of protein, and I think that's very vague. So that percentage of protein is going to be a lot clearer if you actually look at the sources of the protein, which are the ingredients. And ideally, quite a few ingredients is useful. The main one I would try and avoid is high fish meal, if possible, because given these fishes don't eat fishes, they're not going to be able to extract as much nutrients from it. And there's plenty of studies looking into if the organism isn't naturally eating fish, is going to find it very difficult to extract particularly calcium, phosphorus from fish meal. And then kind of catering those ingredients to what the fish might eat in the wild. There is quite a few like hobby resources, just reading different websites to see what they might eat in the wild, and then trying to get a spectrum of different ingredients that cater for that. So if it eats mostly algae or bacteria or even sponges, a lot of those ingredients aren't available for captive diets. So I'd just say that a diversity of algae within the diet is going to be best. And plants, vegetables don't really cater for algae, because the main thing there is that they're entirely different. A lot of amino acids, so they're the building blocks that make up proteins, are quite exclusive to different groups of organisms, and algae are one. They're very high in protein compared to a lot of plants. So they're very different compositionally to plants. So don't go for a diet that contains a lot of plants if you're trying to cater for something that eats algae. If there's something does eat a lot of plants, there's not many loricariids that do. A lot of their habitats aren't sort of vast in plants compared to, I guess, other fishes that might grab a lot of terrestrial vegetation. And then if it's a carnivore, maybe thinking what type of carnivore. If they are eating fish, then great. Different types of fish meals, a diversity of it would be great. And then if it's eating mostly invertebrates, trying to get that diversity of different invertebrate ingredients in. If possible, if they are eating mostly mollusks and snails, then catering for that. I think it's a lot easier for the carnivores because you've got so many different frozen foods to use and mix in. Ideally, don't mix it in if you're using a gel diet, just because it could go off quicker if you mix it directly in the gel, but feeding them as well. The main thing with frozen is avoid stuff like, or don't feed frequently things like frozen mussel. Even whitebait can be a bit risky, and prawns because of diaminase, which is a enzyme or toxin that causes a malnutrition and can cause quite bad issues with some neurological problems. And with the herbivores, I think it's a lot more difficult, algivores or mostly that algae, because there isn't really as much to sort of put in. And I think a lot of diets, hopefully brands catch on that there's so much they can offer, especially the wide range of algae. It's like there's plenty of ingredients around, and adding them or having the option of more brands offering that would be brilliant. Other things sort of to look at diets, I generally would avoid stuff like that contains cellulose as just an ingredient, because it's mainly usually we'll say contains wood, look at the ingredient, it contains cellulose. That and lignin is the one that they definitely cannot digest. So it's just, especially as a main ingredient, that's just going to be a filler. But I think there's a lot more to diets that meets diet, especially when it comes to the word fillers, particularly like all the sort of different ingredients that you see, and they're quite overwhelming, especially like brewer's yeast, stuff like that, or even binding agents are really important. You don't want the food breaking down very quickly in the tank. But then there's the other aspect of you don't want it expanding in the fish's stomach. But yeah.
So definitely, yeah. So you went through a lot of the challenges for folks who are keeping catfish. So I guess, and you sort of talked about this in your answer previously, but let's say someone is a little bit overwhelmed and they've just got a catfish. So maybe but step by step, what should they do in terms of how they figure out what to feed it?
So I'll definitely take a quick look at websites like Scott Cat and Planet Catfish, because they give you sort of a quick vague guide. If you're totally not sure, or some fishes there's no idea what is available or what they actually feed on, there's nothing listed on hobby websites, then I kind of always take a look at like ResearchGate, or just type in the name of the fish, ideally get the scientific name, and then just put journal diet, because then you're going to get it's probably not the easiest way to do it, and it is obviously going through quite dense paperwork, but that's going to produce the most reliable way of finding a diet, is looking at what has been found in the wild, so their gut analysis, what people have actually identified from the fish in the wild. Otherwise, there's loads of different websites that offer resources, and you can always ask different people what they've had success with. So quite a few websites have like breeding reports on what they've had success with feeding that fish, and looking at the body shape, you can see where they feed based on where their mouth is shaped. So if it's faced sort of superiorly, so that's up top, that fish is going to be feeding on the surface. Terminally, then it's going to be feeding most likely straight in front of it, but that it can be a little bit deceptive. And then if it's got a ventry facing mouth, so facing down, then it's going to be feeding mostly on the bottom. And you can look almost other aspects of that. So say Corydoras, they've got that really, well, to different extents, that shovel nose that goes into a substrate. So they're going to be feeding on organisms within there. Most likely, obviously, like invertebrates, because they don't have that ability to sort of extract any sort of biofilms or algae, whereas loricariids have that oral disc with the teeth that are quite obvious, and most they can be feeding on the surface. But it is quite a challenge, and there's not always much available.
That's great advice. So I know you've obviously, spoken to hobbyists, and you've got some articles out there. Are there any questions that you get maybe asked commonly that, maybe we haven't covered?
So, well, questions that I get asked a lot, because there are so many catfishes, the biggest thing is actually identifying what catfish you have. And a lot of these groups get confused, especially sometimes it doesn't make as much difference in care, but sometimes it makes a lot, especially in adult size. So it's quite often people will confuse, say, Corydoras with Synodontis, or even with the loricariid plex. So generally, I think it's very important to use websites that, always take a look at places like Planet Catfish that have that massive pictorial guide. Same with a lot of groups, it's taking a look at the different ones. And also, if you're identifying something, don't assume the most rare, assume the most common, because that's most likely to be the answer. And asking online, there's some reliable groups, there's some not. It's a whole hit and miss thing. But places like Catfishes of the World, there's scientists that will help reply to anyone's questions on that. And also the Catfish Study Group, which is the UK Catfish Society. So, yeah, that's probably the most common thing.
That's great. I didn't even think about that. You're right. A lot of folks don't maybe know how to ID or are confused by what they're looking at. So, well, we are unfortunately out of time. I wanted to once again thank you, Rebecca, a lot for your time, and hopefully have you on again at some point as we get a little further into catfishes. Also want to thank our producer, Mark Winter, for making this show possible. Rebecca, did you have any final words of wisdom or anything you want to kind of impart on our listeners before we close out?
I think always question everything you've been told on the hobby and look at it from a scientific standpoint and do as much research as possible, and don't underestimate groups of fishes, and just do as much scientific research. Question your sources and question whether they're getting their information right and where they're getting their information from, I think is the most important thing.
Yeah, excellent advice, and not just with this topic, but with almost everything. So definitely appreciate that. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Please be sure to check out Rebecca's web links, which will be found on her Aquariumania guest page. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for a show, email me at drroy@petliferadio.com. That's DRROY@petliferadio.com. Until next time, please be sure to visit your local aquarium stores, keep your tanks clean and your fish healthy, and feed your catfishes properly.
Let's Talk Pets, every week on demand, only on PetLifeRadio.com.